Welcome to this recorded version. In this presentation, we will look at compartmentalization as a tool for improved resilience to African swine fever in productions. The introduction of African swine fever virus in a disease-free country leads to catastrophic consequences for the swine industry. This includes the high mortality and the culling in affected farms, but also the loss of international markets for pork products, in particular fresh pork, and the consequences of disease investigation and control activities. These include preemptive culling on epidemiological contacts and also animal movement restrictions in infected areas. When fattening pigs have exceeded market weight and cannot be sent to slaughter plants, they need to be culled for welfare reasons. The broader outcomes of such introduction are issues of food security and supply, business closures, loss of jobs, staff mental health issues, and animal welfare issues. Several tools are available to government and industry players to manage these risks. In disease-free times, these include prevention and preparedness activities, as well as reinforcing early detection surveillance programs. Also, zoning and compartmentalization may be implemented either in disease-free countries or in disease-infected areas. To support business continuity, they must be implemented before the first outbreaks. After African swine fever has been introduced in a country, response and eradication activities are deployed in the aim of regaining a free status. Zoning and compartmentalization are the two main tools that are best able to support the industry in preemptively managing the risk of a disease introduction in the country. Zoning is a well-established method which is used for many infectious diseases in many countries around the world to support the continuity of international trade of animal products. Zoning agreements between trading partners may be concluded a priori or after a country lost its free status. In any case, such agreements may take a long time to be signed, which can result in delays in regaining access to international markets for the industry. Also, zones are defined as disease-free populations by geographical boundaries and do not allow to differentiate between farms of different biosecurity stages. A high biosecurity production system may not be able to benefit from zoning if it is located in an area with many lower biosecurity farms. Also, if there is an outbreak in a pre-agreed zone, all farms will lose their health status, regardless of their biosecurity level. With these considerations in mind, compartmentalization offers an alternative option to defining disease-free pig population. The boundaries can be set by common management and husbandry practices in the case of a compartment. Compartment pigs have an ASF status which is distinct from the rest of the country. This means that in case of an introduction of virus in the country, a pre-approved ASF compartment would retain its disease-free status, while the virus would be assumed to be potentially present in the rest of the country. The compartmentalization concept has been introduced officially in the early 2000s by the OIE and is supported by international animal health standards. For more details, there are two relevant chapters in the Terrestrial Animal Health Code. The aspect of compartmentalization that interests us most in the context of business continuity is the possibility to implement and obtain agreement for an ASF-free compartment in a disease-free territory. It is also possible in an ASF-infected country, but is likely to be more difficult and would address recovery rather than continuity. This means that the trade negotiation can be led in advance and include the conditions for continuity of trade. Would the country where the compartment is located lose its ASF-free status? In principle, seamless business continuity is possible, with no downtime in pork export from the compartment. The second aspect of compartmentalization that is critical for business management is that it provides a way to be less dependent on the status and practices of others, allowing highly integrated production systems to depend less on smallholder farmers or on the presence of susceptible wildlife. For a successful implementation, compartments may be developed within a dedicated national program. This program will prescribe the national standards, define the governance structure, including roles and responsibilities, define how supervision and auditing are conducted, as well as consider the type of ASF surveillance which is required outside compartments. The program would also contain the required regulatory elements. Different frameworks are also possible in some cases, such as isolated compartments in the absence of a national program. Let's have a look at a possible distribution of roles. The statutory authority, generally the Veterinary Authority, is responsible for granting and removing compartment status of individual compartments, as well as leading the trade negotiation with their counterparts in the importing countries. There may or may not be a separate program administrator to delegate some of the routine work to. This is a great opportunity to involve the swine industry representative bodies. The compartment operator is the company which operates the compartment and implements the risk management plan that has been validated by the authority. Other key stakeholders to consider are the diagnostic laboratories and accredited auditors. Compartmentalization requires strong public-private partnerships to be developed and implemented successfully. It allows the industry to be more effectively involved in preparing and recovering from an ASF introduction. Now that we have looked at the overall structure of such a program, let's consider some of the compartment-level components. While what we have discussed so far would apply to most species and diseases, the following considerations are more targeted to ASF itself. The key component in designing a compartment is the definition of its boundaries, which are the premises under a common biosecurity system. Premises to consider are farms, but also boar sites, slaughter plants, and post-processing facilities. The definition will depend on the type of products that are exported. Is it live animal, genetic materials, or fresh pork, for example? The definition will also affect the requirements for traceability. The aim of this component is to support the claim of disease-free status by recording all entries and exits to demonstrate the integrity of the compartment population. The next important step is biosecurity. Biosecurity starts with a risk assessment, which will inform a custom risk management plan, including biosecurity measures addressing each of the disease introduction pathways. This figure illustrates the pathways for introduction of ASF virus which should be considered. It was prepared for a specific swine producer, and so it could be a bit different for another system. The pathways can be classified in 4 broad groups: people, pigs and pig products, fomites, and proximity pathways. The relative importance of each will depend on the specific production system. For instance, when feed ingredients of porcine origin are not used, such as spray-dried porcine plasma, no further mitigation would be required for this pathway. Regarding wildlife, the level of risk would depend on whether the pigs are housed in fully enclosed barns, whether they have outdoor access, and whether feral or wild pigs are present in the region. After identifying the pathways, the team in charge of developing the candidate compartment will consider how the risk management plan will meet each of the national standard requirements. Broadly, these include requirements in terms of infrastructure, procedure, and record keeping. For example, if we consider the pathway introduction via live pigs, the mitigation measures to consider include quarantine infrastructure, quarantine procedures, diagnostic testing, as well as thorough record keeping of animal movements into the compartment. Here are 3 other important elements to consider when developing a risk management plan for an ASF-free compartment. First, the measures must be adapted to the type of premises and will vary between farms and slaughter plants, for example. Second, while a strong plan is required, the compliance level is also a critical factor. Workplace culture, incentives, and disincentives will affect how much staff adhere to and follow the biosecurity measures. Last, the exhaustive documentation of the management plan for the candidate compartment is a time-consuming process and should not be underestimated. It will provide the basis for the Veterinary Authority for assessment and audit purposes. I will now hand over to my colleague for some further consideration.
The last topic we will cover in this presentation is about disease surveillance in the context of compartmentalization. This is obviously a critical topic when implementing a compartment, and disease surveillance can be divided into two main components: internal surveillance and external surveillance. Internal surveillance means surveillance implemented within the compartment by the compartment operator. External surveillance is implemented outside the compartment by the vet authorities. Internal surveillance has two objectives. The first one is early detection and aims to ensure that if the disease is introduced in the compartment, then the disease will be detected early. The aim is to minimize the spread of the disease within the barn and to other premises, but most importantly, to minimize the risk of exporting contaminated products. This last point is really the key when talking about compartmentalization, as the objective is really to ensure business continuity. The second objective of internal surveillance is to demonstrate freedom of disease. The surveillance system in place must confirm the absence of the disease in the pig population under surveillance. This is especially important when talking about African swine fever, because the clinical sign of the disease can be quite unspecific. Different tools are available to meet these objectives. The first one is syndromic surveillance. The idea here is to continuously monitor mortality levels and/or some morbidity indicators and to raise an alarm every time something abnormal is detected in the pig population. Another option is to develop a risk-based surveillance plan targeting ASF-compatible mortality clusters occurring in a barn. This is one approach we assessed in a recent publication published in Transboundary and Emerging Diseases. The idea was to use the fact that ASF is not a highly contagious disease, meaning that the first pigs dying from ASF, once the disease has been introduced in a barn, are likely to be clustered in space, like, for example, in the first infected pen. The definition of ASF-compatible mortality is a bit tricky, given the unspecific clinical signs of ASF. In our study, this definition includes all sudden deaths and all animals dead after presenting at least one of the following symptoms: fever, inappetence, depression, coughing, vomiting, ice discharge, recumbency, skin lesions non-attributable to trauma or parasitic diseases. I will let you have a look at the publication if you are interested, but based on the simulation we did, with this approach, we were able to reach a sensitivity of 95% of detecting ASF within the first 15 days of introduction. The objectives of external surveillance are slightly different, as they are related to the Veterinary Authority and not to the compartment operator. The objectives here are to know the level of risk that the compartment is exposed to and identify changes occurring in this level of risk. For example, the external surveillance plan should be able to detect when the disease is introduced in the wild boar population. To meet this objective, different tools can be used, like passive surveillance with hunters and veterinarians, or laboratory-based surveillance systems. During this presentation, we gave you an overview on how compartmentalization can be applied to ensure business continuity in the face of ASF. Implementing compartmentalization for ASF is not an issue in itself. The disease can be controlled with good biosecurity measures, and it's a very good example or candidate to develop a compartment. This is, however, not the case for every disease. If we take, for example, the case of foot and mouth diseases, because the disease is airborne, implementing effective biosecurity measures will be more complicated, and thus developing a compartment for this disease will be more challenging. Implementing a compartment for ASF is, however, associated with some challenges due to the nature of the compartmentalization itself. Among the challenges associated with compartmentalization, the three most important are business continuity, the acceptance of the compartments by the vet authorities, and the acceptance of the compartments by the trading partners. Business continuity can be threatened if the transition from peacetime, basically when the country is free from the disease, to wartime, when the country gets infected by the disease, has not been well prepared. This transition is a very delicate step in the life of a compartment, and it must be carefully planned in advance to meet the objective of zero downtime in case of the disease introduction. The question of the abattoir is also critical for business continuity, especially when considering the risk posed by fresh meat from clinically healthy animals. The role of the abattoir should be also carefully discussed and defined when building the compartment. The acceptance of the compartment by the vet authority is conditioned by the strength and effectiveness of the public-private partnership. If such a relationship does not exist, it might compromise the development of a compartment. The vet authority must be also able to provide clear documentation, practical audit procedures, and good external surveillance to convince the trading partners that the compartment in place is reliable. Finally, the acceptance of the compartment by trading partners is conditioned by good communication, transparency, and, as I just said before, by the quality of the external disease surveillance plan. In addition, trust and confidence between the stakeholders must be built before an outbreak occurs. They are already the key to ensure the business continuity when the risks posed by the disease change in the compartment. Based on these few examples, there are some situations where compartmentalization might not be the most appropriate tool to ensure business continuity. For example, it can be quite expensive to develop a compartment, depending on the existing infrastructure. If the cost of implementation exceeds the revenue from international exports, maybe other tools will be more appropriate. Similarly, if the production system is not vertically integrated and/or if there are many sources of inputs impossible to control, implementing a compartment becomes quickly impractical. It might be also not necessary to implement a compartment when there are no export markets. Improving biosecurity or surveillance will be always useful, but not the compartmentalization framework as a whole. To conclude this presentation, there are four main take-home messages. The first one is that compartmentalization is an important tool to ensure business continuity, empowering the industry players and allowing them to take proactive actions to protect their own business. The second one is that compartmentalization is definitely a great opportunity to develop and strengthen public-private partnerships, which is always useful when talking about animal health. The third point is that compartmentalization can help reinforce biosecurity and surveillance systems across the board. This is useful for the disease targeted by the compartment, of course, but not only. Last but not least, compartmentalization is great, but this tool is better adapted to integrated production systems involved in international trade. We would like to thank you for your attention, and we will be happy to answer the question you may have now or later by emails.